Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're validating the very real, very intense pain of one-sided affection and digging into the actual science of unrequited love. Look, if you've ever found yourself hopelessly stuck on someone who just doesn't feel the same way, you know exactly how destabilizing and, let's be honest, kind of humiliating it can feel. But today, we're going to look under the hood. We'll explore exactly what's happening in your brain and your psychology, and more importantly, how to actually break free. So let's dive right in with a question that might hit a little close to home. Why does loving someone who doesn't love you back cause actual, literal physical pain? We've all heard the term heartbreak, right? But it turns out that's not just some poetic metaphor. It is a biological reality. The pain you're feeling, it's this wild, complex cocktail of desire, hope, rejection, and actual neurological withdrawal. And hey, if you're in the thick of this right now, I need you to know you are not crazy and you are absolutely not alone. Research by psychologists Baumeister and Stillwell found that an astonishing 92.8% of us have gone through this painful emotional imbalance at least once in just a 5-year period. It is incredibly common, yet somehow it creates a level of distress that can honestly be way worse than the rough patches we hit in a normal, reciprocated relationship.
All right, moving on to Section 1, Limerence and Crystallization. So back in the 1970s, psychologist Dorothy Tenevoff interviewed over 500 people and came up with this brilliant term, limerence. She used it to describe this intense, involuntary longing that goes way, way beyond a simple crush. It's that overwhelming, sometimes totally debilitating absorption in the person you desire. You know the feeling. Your entire mood completely depends on what they do. You find yourself analyzing every tiny little interaction, right? Just searching for any hidden sign of passion. It's essentially being madly in love, but heavily, heavily defined by constant uncertainty.
But here's the absolute kicker. In a state of limerence, you aren't necessarily responding to the actual, real-life person. Nope, you're responding to a fantasy. You've essentially constructed an idealized version of them in your head, and that's who you're falling for. And actually, sometimes this is a sneaky defense mechanism. By projecting all our desires onto someone who is totally unavailable, whether emotionally or physically, we basically get to experience a safe, superficial version of love. One that completely dodges the messy vulnerabilities and real risks of an actual committed relationship.
And this perfectly brings us to a concept Tenevoff called crystallization. She borrowed this gorgeous metaphor from the French writer Stendhal. Imagine tossing a plain, ugly tree branch into a salt mine. If you leave it there, over time it gets completely covered in these shimmering crystals until it looks like this incredibly beautiful object. Well, in limerence, your brain is doing the exact same thing to your crush. You totally ignore all their red flags, their flaws, or the fact that they literally aren't interested, and you just magnify their beautiful traits. You've essentially crystallized them in your mind.
Let's transition over to Section 2, your brain on heartbreak.
Now, let's talk chemistry, because there is a massive, stark contrast between what our brain expects to happen and what it actually gets. When you feel close to someone, your brain is gearing up for a huge rush of dopamine, which is all about motivation and reward, and oxytocin, the bonding hormone. But in unrequited love, that connection gets denied. So instead of the happy chemicals, your brain gets flooded with cortisol, the stress hormone. This massive chemical imbalance throws your system into a state of literal withdrawal. It's exactly like kicking an addiction. Neuroscientists actually call this a reward prediction error. Your brain fully expects a reward, it gets absolutely nothing, and as a result, it becomes laser focused on craving it. And it gets worse. If that person gives you intermittent reinforcement, maybe they flash you a random smile or send a late night text out of nowhere, your brain treats it exactly like a slot machine. It hands your painfully wired brain just enough hope to keep pulling the lever, keeping that whole exhausting emotional attachment alive.
And we actually have the receipts for this through functional MRI scans. Brain imaging by researchers like Helen Fisher shows that romantic rejection completely lights up the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, which is the brain's craving and motivation center. But here's the wild part. It also activates the insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. Why does that matter? Because those are the exact same neural pathways that process physical injury. So your brain is literally registering unrequited love exactly like a physical blow. That is exactly why your chest feels physically tight and your stomach actually aches.
Okay, moving into Section 3, the psychological traps. So why do some of us get stuck in this terrible loop for so much longer than others? Well, folks with anxious attachment styles or lower self-esteem tend to really internalize this rejection.
You might find yourself using cognitive biases to overanalyze every single minor interaction. You start mind reading, convincing yourself that deep down they secretly love you, but they're just, afraid of their feelings. But as we just talked about, this idealization is a massive psychological trap. It keeps the fantasy alive because, frankly, the fantasy feels a lot safer than facing the harsh reality of being rejected.
But check this out. Here's a fascinating twist. Research actually suggests that the person doing the rejecting often suffers too. I know, we usually just focus on the agony of the person with the crush. But the object of your affection is often sitting there experiencing high anxiety, deep frustration, and a ton of intense guilt over having to deflect these unwanted advances. They might even try to soften the blow with appeasing language, saying things like, "I just don't want a relationship right now," which is meant to be nice, but unfortunately, it just feeds right back into the admirer's false hope. Let's wrap things up with Section 4, Strategies to Let Go. Here's the truth. You don't heal by just magically forcing yourself to stop caring. You need a real, actionable roadmap to regulate your overloaded nervous system. Step 1 is establishing incredibly strict boundaries. That means limiting physical and digital contact so you can finally shut down that slot machine reinforcement. You also need to actually acknowledge the grief without letting it ruin your entire day, maybe by carving out just 15 minutes to journal. And finally, behavioral activation. Get out there, do your hobbies, exercise, do the things that will naturally boost those plummeted dopamine levels.
Now, a really crucial step here is cognitive reframing. This means actively catching and challenging your distorted thoughts. When your brain starts looping on this idea of personalization, telling you, oh, they don't love me because I'm just not enough or I'm unattractive, you have to consciously hit the brakes. Remind yourself that human attraction is a ridiculously complex, highly personal mix of variables. Their lack of reciprocation is absolutely not a verdict on your inherent worth.
Unrequited love has this way of artificially narrowing your entire world down to a single person. You become totally absorbed. So the real key to healing is deliberately forcing that lens wide open again. You have to reclaim your identity. Go reconnect with the friendships, the passions, and the personal goals that you've probably put on the back burner while you were busy pouring all your energy into chasing a phantom connection. I'm going to leave you with this final, empowering thought today. Look, unrequited love is agonizing, no doubt about it, but it's also an incredibly universal human experience. By understanding the actual science behind what's happening to you, you strip away so much of its power. So the question is, what amazing things can you achieve? And what parts of yourself can you reclaim now that your energy is no longer tied up in an unreciprocated fantasy? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, remember to be kind to yourself as you heal.